Welcome to the Schulz Museum. I am Sarah Merrick. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here. And today we are having a very fun celebration of jazz with a few different folks. The first of whom are sitting right next to me. We've got author Derrick Bang and radio show host Bill Buchanan over here, both of whom have a long time history of working together. And we get to be a part of that today. So Derrick is here to talk about his book about Vince Guaraldi, the beloved musician behind a lot of the Peanuts music that I'm sure you have heard before. You were listening as you walked in today. But without further ado, I'm going to let them take over. Make sure you join us after for a book signing right in the lobby. And also, I'm sure you haven't missed it, we have Healdsburg Jazz in the main hall of the museum. So please join us for that concert as well. All right, Derrick and Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, so I'm Bill Buchanan. I get to have the fun part here of just helping Derrick tell his story, the story about Vince Guaraldi.
Which I couldn't do unless I had somebody feeding me questions.
That's right. I'm his foil. If you want the real knowledge, it's over there. But anyway, we thought we'd start with just a show of hands, to kind of help calibrate the answers a little bit. How many people in the audience know about Vince Guaraldi already? Okay. How many know a fair amount about him? All right. And then how many of you perhaps contributed to Derrick's book because you know so much about him? Okay.
Actually, why don't you stand and be recognized, please, for the people who don't know you? Come on.
Oh, the first awkward moment.
Come on. Don't be shy. So, one of the children back in the day who sang in a Charlie Brown Christmas. And David, you too. Another one.
Yeah. What?
Diane.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for being here and for joining us today. But if you want to learn more about Vince Guaraldi, this is the place to be today. But Derrick, I thought I'd start with a broad question. It'll be maybe kind of an obvious question here, but still, who was Vince Guaraldi?
Vince was born in the North Bay region of San Francisco in 1928, July 17th. He grew up in a very musical family. Both of his mother's brothers, Joe and Muzzy Marcelino, were big band jazz leaders at the time. Joe stayed in the San Francisco area, leading a number of big bands at restaurants and had a very successful series of gigs for 30-odd years. Muzzy went down to Hollywood, got involved with Art Linkletter, and he was also famous for his whistling. When you hear the hit single version of the title theme to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, that's Vince's uncle whistling on that song. Lassie, the classic Lassie, with the Whistler theme. That's Vince's Uncle Muzzy. Vince started playing piano very young at age 5. By the time he hit high school, he was the most popular kid in the school because everybody knew that if you wanted to have a great party, all you had to do was invite Vince, and he would spend the entire evening playing boogie woogie. He served in the Korean War briefly, about which he absolutely never spoke. I'm not of the impression that anything bad happened. It was just something he chose not to discuss. And then immediately after coming back, he began seriously trying to earn a living as a jazz musician. First teamed up with Cal Tjader in a trio in the very early 1950s. Ultimately joined Woody Herman's Third Herd in the middle 1950s. Rejoined Cal Tjader, this time as a quintet in 57 through 59. Formed his own trios in the 60s, and then I should probably stop and let you take over.
Yeah, I mean, having read the book and then listening to you again now, what strikes me is just how much he'd already done before he entered the Peanuts world.
Before he became himself.
But yeah, before he became the Vince Guaraldi that we largely know of. I mean, again, we'll get to Cast Your Fate in the Wind in a minute here, because that was pre-Peanuts and it was a big hit. One more general question. Everybody in this room, I think, has a sense of why we like his music. But overall, what's the appeal of his music? Why do you think it caught on? Why so influential?
He came in at the very beginning of what was a big bossa nova surge in the United States in the very late 50s through the early 60s. And he immediately embraced that style. And that is the style that he would become known for throughout his entire career. It's almost impossible to do this at this great remove, but as an exercise, if you try to remove all the music he wrote for the Peanut specials from those specials and just listen to it as music, you'll recognize that these are all mostly bossa nova tunes. They're catchy, they're cheerful, they make you smile. I'm stunned by the facility that he had to, even when he was a sideman in Cal Tjader's group, and you know how classic jazz groups would work, you'd introduce a song at the top end, and then various sidemen would get a solo, right? And then you'd come back to the melody and wrap the song up. Well, when Vince took his solos, you could extract those solos. They were songs unto themselves. He had this great knack for writing a song which you'd swear you've heard before, even as you're hearing it for the first time. That's magic. And honestly, I think that's why we still listen to him today.
Yeah, there's something that's just very universal. I'm reminded, I've got the quote here. This is from your book, where you quote San Francisco music critic Ralph Gleason. And here he's talking about the Peanuts music. And he says, Guaraldi, quote, took his inspiration from the creations of Charles Schulz and made music that reflects that inspiration, is empathetic with the image, and is still unmistakably Vince Guaraldi. It's kind of an elusive discussion there, but I think he's getting at this point that you can, like you said a minute ago, you can hear it, I think you've almost heard it before. It's just that recognizable. And of course, he played and played and played and played.
Charlie Brown Christmas would be my desert island disc. I play it all year round, much to my wife's chagrin. Well, not entirely. No, but seriously, it's, I mean, yes, that particular album is a Christmas album, but his music, it's part of his music as a whole, which I don't necessarily associate with any given holiday. It's just Vince Guaraldi.
So this is the second edition of your book, and later on we'll get into why you wrote a second edition. But point is, the first edition you wrote was 12, 13 years ago now, and you were able to talk to a lot of the people who had played with Vince Guaraldi. Some are still with us, a lot no longer are, exceeding in the passing time. What did they tell you about him as a musician? What did they tell you about what he was like to perform with?
He was totally focused on music, constantly, 24/7. I'm amazed he had a family, honestly. And his first wife, only wife, would probably claim that he didn't really. But he had a great sense of humor, told jokes, instantaneously made up pet names for people with whom he worked. When John Scott Trotter came along, starting with It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, to help orchestrate the music that Guaraldi was writing, he immediately gave him the nickname Trotsky, which he never used to John's face. Vince had a quick temper, very quick temper, but he also cooled down very quickly. He did not talk to people while he was performing. He did not want to be bothered while he was performing. He didn't like people making noise while he was performing. There was one infamous case when he was playing in Sausalito at the Trident, when a group of ladies sitting at a table were making too much noise, and he hurled an ashtray at them and wound up in court. It was settled out of court. Nobody was injured. But Off stage, he demanded to be the center of attention. Toward the end of his career, when he had become famous enough to be courted by wealthier folks in the Bay Area, they would invite him over to play, which he would do either as a soloist or with his trio. And after he was done, after they were done, he would mingle. And he loved being the center of attention, and he was the center of attention. One of his sidemen told me that he was astonished being at one of these parties, which also featured an astronaut who had been up in space. Nobody was talking to the astronaut. They were talking to Vince.
Yeah, that was a party I remember reading about that in your book, one of the parties on the peninsula.
Yeah.
There's a Northern California aspect to what he did too, and I suspect that's part of it. People here really knew him and on that social side. How much did that influence his, I mean, again, learning this from your book, he played with Van Morrison, he played with Jerry Garcia, all sorts of really interesting people in there whose names I don't know and whose names may not be well known outside of musicians in general. How much did that influence him, Northern California?
Well, basically, he didn't like leaving, and he never did. He had no choice early in his career. He had to tour. That's what you did. When he was with the Chater Trio, particularly with Woody Herman's Third Herd, I have a copy of part of their early 1956 tour schedule, which actually started on New Year's Eve, 1955, and continued through June, okay? So we're talking almost half a year. The April schedule has them playing every single night in a different city. There was one night off in the middle. And as he put it, you'd play, you'd take your kit, throw it into the car, you'd immediately drive 300, 400, 500 miles to the next city, you'd crash, you'd get up, you'd eat, you'd play. Again, lather, rinse, repeat. He hated it. And once he got the Peanuts gig in particular, it was such a relief because he no longer had to tour. Most musicians have to tour in order to make money. Album sales, no, I mean, it's not as bad today as it was back then, but for the most part, the label got most of the money on the album sales. If you wanted to make money, you had to tour. And as soon as he didn't have to tour, he stopped because he loved being in the greater San Francisco area. He'd occasionally bop down to Los Angeles, but never stay very long.
But you make the point in the book, too, that he loved playing so much that even later, when he didn't have to, he would anyway because he just liked it. He just played in the Bay Area.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have retired and stayed in his house and not done a thing except scoring the next Peanut special from about 1967 on. But no, he was, I mean, when he died, he was still doing 4 nights a week at Butterfield's in Menlo Park.
All right, so that's a little bit about him and his performing and maybe his background. Obviously, we're here today, and most people know him for his Peanuts music. There are some important additional accomplishments. But let's start with Peanuts, right? So let's go through that. He scored 15 Peanuts TV specials. And he did a 1964 documentary before that.
Right, which is only available here at the museum.
Yeah, it never aired.
Never aired.
Yeah.
Can you believe it? 1964, no network wanted to put Charlie Brown on the air.
A year later, that changed.
What can I say?
He did the first big screen Peanuts film in 1969.
Right, A Boy Named Charlie Brown. Not to be confused with the documentary called A Boy Named Charlie Brown. Not to be confused with the album that was released called A Boy Named Charlie Brown. Not to be confused with the movie soundtrack that was released called A Boy Named Charlie Brown.
Yeah, so one of the services that I got from Derrick's book was, as a reader, you don't have to keep track of all this. He's done it for you. It's all right in there. And he does. You explain all this. But let's start with the Peanuts story. How did Guaraldi come into the Peanuts fold?
Okay. Fasten your seatbelts. This is a bumpy ride. Apologies to Betty Davis. In very late 1959, the film Black Orpheus came to the United States in San Francisco art house theaters as a marvelous bossa nova score by Antonio Carlos Jobim and Louis Bonfa. Guaraldi went and saw the film many times. He loved it. Came up with the idea that he wanted to do an album of jazz arrangements of the 4 primary themes from that movie. Now, he didn't have a record label at this point in time. He had had a contract with Fantasy Records, which originally started as a 3-record deal. The first 2 albums he released were critically acclaimed, but box office duds, as they say in the movie biz. So Fantasy chose to sever the contract before he had to do the 3rd album. So Guaraldi and his trio did a demo tape of themes from the Black Orpheus film. He tried to shop it first to Capitol Records. They passed. Columbia Records. They passed. Reluctantly, he returned to Fantasy Records, pitched the idea to Max Weiss. Max bit. He said, sure, we'll do it. 1 record deal, 1 stipulation. You have to pay for the studio time. That was Max.
Yeah, there's a whole story in there about that record contract.
So they start to lay down the album. They very quickly realize that the themes from that film are only going to fill the A side. So we need to put stuff on the B side. So Guaraldi and his trio did covers of a couple of songs on side B, and then he threw in 2 originals, one called Almaville and one called Castrophe to the Wind, which he'd been noodling in clubs since late 1958. So the record drops on April 12th, April 18th, 1962. And nothing happens for several months. And then we come to what I refer to as the Sacramento Miracle. A radio station DJ named Tony Big at Sacramento's KROY 1240 AM got the single that had Castrophe to the Wind on the B side and one of the themes from Black Orpheus on the A side. Played the A side, thought it was okay, played the B side, really liked it. So he started playing that song whenever he could in his show. Well, there were very strict rules back then in AM radio that you could not play the same song more than once in a given hour unless it was a selected song, which this most definitely was not. But being that this was an instrumental and being that Tony Big was a crafty guy, whenever he got to the close to the top of the hour and he had like 90 seconds left over before they had to do the news at the top of the hour, he'd play Castrophe to the Wind. So he'd sneak in a second playing. Well, pretty soon the station manager, Buck Herring, caught wind of what was going on and was just about to tell Tony to knock it off when Buck decided, you know what, let's make this a chosen song, which allowed everybody at the station to play it as often as they wanted to within reason. Well, this came to the attention of hit pickers, sort of industry guys who at that point in time would pay attention to regional trends and then alert their stations in other parts of the country that, you know, this seems to be an up-and-coming song, which is what happened. Sacramento spread to Los Angeles, to San Diego, and then St. Louis, and then Chicago, and then New York, and then moved in. Castrophe to the Wind finally entered the Billboard Hot 100 the final week of December 1962. Now, are you paying attention to the timeline here? April 18th, late December. Okay, the song peaked at number 22, which is very respectable for a jazz instrumental, and lasted on the charts for 19 weeks. The album lasted on the charts for 28 weeks into 1963. The song peaked at number 22 on February 23rd. This is almost a year after the record and the single dropped. Can you imagine that happening today? I mean, if you don't hit today within, what, 5 days, you're gone.
So it strikes me you're describing an analog version of something going viral, and it was very slowly.
Yeah, very slowly. Oh my God, I can't point to another one. I really can't. It won a Grammy Award in 1963 for Best Instrumental Jazz Composition, which he got lucky. That's a category that only existed for 7 years. So, sidebar. Meanwhile, Lee Mendelson, a writer, director, producer, worked at KPIX in San Francisco, delivered for them during the 2 years that he worked there a series of award-winning documentaries. Peabody Award-winning, as it turned out. That's no small thing. In early 1963, he decided to hang up his own shingle, form his own film company, Lee Mendelson Film Productions, in the entertainment hotspot of Northern California, beautiful downtown Burlingame. Good, that was a laugh line, thank you.
It's still beautiful downtown Burlingame.
For his first production, he sinks everything he's got into a documentary about baseball great Willie Mays. I am getting to the answer, I promise.
It's part of that slow viral part. Yeah.
So this airs in October of 1963, does very well for NBC. It was, in fact, the first documentary that had been purchased by a network from an independent film company. That just didn't happen back then. So Lee looks around, trying to figure out what he wants to do next, and he loved to tell this story with this laugh line. Having done a show about the world's best baseball player, I decided I wanted to follow up with a show about the world's worst baseball player. And who is that? Of course, that's Charlie Brown. Oh.
That's why we like Charlie Brown, Derrick. It's like he's sympathetic for him.
So he cold called Charles Schulz, who was in the phone book. Oh, such innocent times. And pitched a concept of kind of, I'm thinking of it kind of like a day in the life of a cartoonist documentary. And Schulz initially wasn't all that interested, and Lee could tell he was failing. So he said, by any chance, did you see the documentary that was just on TV about Willie Mays? And Schulz said, yeah, I did. I liked that show. Why do you ask? Well, I did that show. And again, the way Lee told this story, I keep saying present tense, isn't that awful? I'm sorry, Jason. There was a pause. And then Schulz said something along the lines of, well, if Willie Mays could trust you, I guess I can. Let's see what we can do. So they worked together for the next several months, working on what initially developed into a 1-hour special, which initially was going to be called A Man Named Charlie Brown, later retitled A Boy Named Charlie Brown. Lee knew that he wanted some animation, but he could only afford like a couple minutes of animation. So Schulz recommended Bill Melendez, who had been doing marvelous little television commercials with the Peanuts gang for Ford Motor Company. You can find these on YouTube, they're just darling. And the Peanuts kids also animated, introduced the star of the Tennessee Ernie Ford show during the final season. It was on television, and some of those are also available on YouTube, also very charming. Okay, so Lee's got his animation. Now, he knew he wanted a jazz backdrop. This was a hard sell with Schulz, who preferred classical music, but Schulz deferred to Mendelssohn's recommendation. First, he asked Dave Brubeck, who was a good friend, and Brubeck declined, citing too much work. Then he asked Cal Tjader, with whom Lee went to high school, and Tjader said basically the same thing. Years later, both of them told Lee repeatedly how much they regretted having answered that way. But can we imagine what the Peanuts landscape would sound like today? So, and here we go, serendipitous, God looking down. Lee's driving over the Golden Gate Bridge one day, listening to the local jazz radio station, and the DJ played Cast Your Fate to the Wind. And Lee thought, that's it, that's the sound I want. So as soon as he could get off the bridge and find a phone booth, you had to do that then, he called the station, got information, got in touch with Vince, pitched the concept. Vince thought about it very briefly and said, yeah, I'd love to do that. Best part of the story. And again, Lee always milked this for all it was worth. So a couple of weeks go by. And Lee gets a call one day from Vince. And Vince says, I got to play you something. And Lee said, okay, fine, I'll drive over. Just, give me half an hour. And Vince said, no. You don't understand. I got to play it for you now. Okay, another quick sidebar. Vince Guaraldi, famed jazz pianist, neither read nor wrote music. How did Vince Guaraldi take notes? He taped himself. Okay? His tape machine apparently wasn't working that day. He knew that Lee played piano, knew music. He said, I got to play this for you now. I don't want to forget it. Lee finally said, okay, fine, go ahead. And Vince played a prototype of what very quickly became what we now know is Linus and Lucy. And again, Lee said, years, decades later, looking back, I knew in that moment that we were really going to have something. Guaraldi and his trio wind up scoring the entire 1-hour special, which, as I mentioned earlier, the networks did not pick up. In desperation, Lee trimmed it down to half an hour, figuring that would be an easier sell. And all kinds of good stuff was left behind, lots of guest stars. That didn't sell either. The worst part, as far as we know, that excise footage is gone. Oh yeah, hey, believe me, I've been moaning about that one for a long time. And there's your answer.
There's a lot of depth to the story. You know, and as I listen to that again, I mean, it strikes me, obviously there's talent. Guaraldi's very talented, and almost in a volcanic sense, it seems to me, like he's writing this, he's got to catch it in the moment. But it's a story of creative people finding each other.
Oh, yes.
And I've thought, you know, if that hadn't happened, if Lee Mendelsohn hadn't heard Cast Your Fate to the Wind driving across,
I mean,
but just think how different Christmas music would be today.
Well, not just that, but for the next, 12, for the next 12 years, they were the Four Musketeers.
Yeah.
I mean, Lee and Bill and Sparky and Vince.
Yeah, and they just changed the soundscape of the holiday, is my point.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, it says something about the influence of Vince Guaraldi, and also just the creative forces that work there and the way that they could find each other.
Well, and the fact that each one of them bowed to all the others' strengths.
Yeah, they worked well as a group.
Yep.
I mean, it seems that way, the longevity of it. Guaraldi's got a lot of things we could talk about, but there's a couple of the things we do need to mention here, I think. One is Cast Your Fate to the Wind. Maybe you sort of explained that one, but that became, you know, a big hit.
Oh yeah, it's still covered to this day.
And still very recognizable. I mean, you know, the pianist music is too, but if you play the first few bars of Cast Your Fate to the Wind,
Yeah, that da, da, da,
yeah, you can probably hear it in your head, even as we sit here.
da, da, da.
He also had the Mass at Grace Cathedral,
and, you know,
and his run with Bolo Sette.
The interesting thing about writing this book was that I discovered early on, even with the first edition, I couldn't do it chronologically because so much was happening to him between like 1963 and 1966. So there are 3 separate chapters that basically cover the same time stream, but focus on a different thing. He was also, in pretty much the same way, contacted to write a jazz mass for the newly consecrated San Francisco Grace Cathedral Theater, which would be part of the year of celebration for the unveiling of this gorgeous new cathedral. And similarly, when he was approached to do this by Chuck Gompertz, who at the time was a young priest in his 20s, which was kind of an audacious thing to do in the 60s, the conversation he had with Vince, after similarly having heard Cast Your Fate to the Wind on the piano, on the radio, and thinking, that's the style. It's not too wild. It won't offend people. He calls Vince, and this time Vince's response was very quick. He says, well, let me think. A mass, huh? Well, Bach, Beethoven, why not me? And so he and his trio worked with members of the St. Paul's Church Choir in San Rafael for about 8 months, getting that ready. And that debuted in May 1965 at the same time that A Charlie Brown Christmas was being readied. And by the way, at the same time, the Vince Guaraldi Quartet, when he was partnered with guitarist Bolo Sette, For 2 years, from early 1964 to early 1966, they were the act in the Bay Area. When they played El Matador in San Francisco or Trois Couleurs in Berkeley, every 2 hours, they had lines wrapped around the block for a little jazz club. I mean, that was what you went to do. I mean, it was like seeing Frank Sinatra in the Bay Area. So all of this was happening at once.
Yeah. You said something a minute ago I just wanted to follow up on. When you said Bach and Beethoven, why not me? Was that just sort of like a quip? Was it confidence?
Oh, it was confidence.
So he was that confident that he could say
absolutely.
that and not have it sound arrogant or ironic or...
Absolutely. And by the way, it became the first jazz mass in a U.S. cathedral in history. And Chuck Gompertz caught a lot of heat for that from certain sectors of society who felt that it was sinful to have the devil's music, which is what jazz was regarded as in some circles, in a house of worship. And they even got some pushback from the Grace Cathedral people. However, it was such a hit, if it's okay to say that a mass was a hit, that Grace Cathedral couldn't scramble quickly enough to bring in Duke Ellington 3 months later.
So that recording is still available.
Oh, yes.
You can still listen to it today. And in
Vince
fact,
Guaraldi at Grace Cathedral.
yeah, and in fact, all of his music, at least that was ever released, is still available,
Which
right?
is not a small thing these days. His albums have never gone out of print. Even during the horrible years of the 70s and early 80s when demon rock and disco blew jazz off the landscape, his albums were all still in print, along with those that he had done with Cal Tjader. No small thing.
So we have a few minutes left before, and we're going to leave a few minutes to ask questions. So you might think about if you have a question you want to ask Derrick. What inspired you to write the book originally?
Oh, boy. Well, I grew up loving his music. I can remember being parked in front of a TV set on December 9th, 1965, wearing pajamas, watching A Charlie Brown Christmas for the first time. And one of the reasons I remember it so vividly is because it was a Thursday night, and I was not allowed to watch TV on school nights, ordinarily. But apparently my parents thought that was a big enough deal that they waived that rule. I loved the music the first time I heard it, but the end credits by so quickly, I didn't know who it was. And when the show was rerun the following year, the credits still went by too quickly and I didn't know who it was. Well, plus I was 10, 11 at the time. I was not sophisticated enough, like today's 10, 11-year-olds, to even imagine that such a thing as a soundtrack album for a TV special might even exist. So I didn't find him that way until a few years later when a cousin of mine let me borrow a copy of his first album for Warner Brothers, Oh Good Grief, which is what you heard when you were coming in here. And then I couldn't get enough. And so I'm trying to answer this rapidly. I, did the deep dive and whatnot. In the early 1990s, when my wife and I became members of a Peanuts Collector Club, and the president wanted a website established, I was chosen to, kind of set it up. And if you're going to set up a website, you need copy, you need stuff for people to read. So I wrote an essay about Guaraldi back in 1993. So that was, you could call that the proto-book. George Winston, who was equally fond of Vince Guaraldi, found that essay because it was the only thing on the web about Vince at that time, and got in touch with me, and we became friends. And through George, I met Vince's son David and his family. So now we move into the uh-ohs in the early 21st century. And, I'm a journalist. God, I hate saying this out loud, a 50-year journalist. And so, the rumbling started in the back of my head, but I kept assuming that somebody inside would do it. One of his sidemen, maybe somebody at Fantasy, one of the big jazz critics, but nobody did. And people started dying. And I thought, okay, looks like it's me.
Well, and so now there's enough interest. You've made this point too, that Guaraldi, the interest in Guaraldi has grown
Yes.
since his death. And so the publisher asked you to do a second version. And again, we've just got a few minutes left, but you must have found out some things for the second version that you didn't know for the first.
The worst and the best thing about doing a book like this is that the moment it came out in April 2012, it was out of date because I started hearing from more people who had bought the book. And some of them were other side men that I had either not known about or not been able to locate. And so I got more stories, more anecdotes. Some were just great personal Guaraldi encounters from people who had a great experience with him, seeing him performing live. The best, I think, was that I heard from, I got to tell this correctly. Somebody got in touch with me one day and said there was a 45 single for sale on eBay with Vince Guaraldi supporting a female singer. And I said, Vince Guaraldi never recorded with a female singer. And he said, well, go look. And I went and looked and said, yeah. Ella Jamerson. I've never heard of this person. Well, I spent way too much money buying that single because somebody else wanted it. Damn his eyes. So I searched, by this point you can do this online. I searched the directory. It looked like Ella Jamerson was still living in the Bay Area. So I called her and she told the most marvelous story. She'd been part of a vocal group called the Apollos, a gospel group in the early 1960s, and they'd been cutting a couple singles for Galaxy Records, which was a subsidiary of Fantasy, and Vince heard them working one day, and he was particularly enchanted by Ella's voice, and he came up and told her, I really like the way you sing, let's do something. So they cut a single, which did nothing because she wasn't that well known, it wasn't that well publicized. But here's the thing, they actually recorded 3 songs that day in the studio. The third song was a vocal version of Cast Your Fate to the Wind, which Fantasy elected to sit on because they knew in 3 months Mel Torme was going to release his version of a vocal of Cast Your Fate to the Wind, which did nothing in the United States, although it was a hit in Australia. To this day, Concord took over Fantasy. It's in Concord's vaults. I have been told by 3 different people that yes, it exists, but they still haven't released it.
There's 2 things left to cover here before we'll open up a couple of questions. One is he died young.
Oh my God.
And he died in between sets at a club.
In the saddle, so to speak.
Yeah, at
Butterfields
in Burlingame.
He and the trio had just completed scoring It's Arbor Day, Charlie Brown. They go to Butterfields to play a set. They play the first set. Butterfields had an arrangement with the Red Cottage Inn next door, which let them use a room as kind of a ready room. He walked in, he stumbled, he fell, he had a heart attack, he was gone.
He was 48.
47.
47. And that was
February 1976.
Yeah.
I was going to UC Davis from 1973 to 77. I knew he was performing. I didn't have a car. I figured, well, he's only in his 40s. What's the rush?
Yeah. Yeah, and he played all the time. I mean, he's like a lot of Bay Area landmarks in a way. You think, well, I'll go tomorrow.
Right.
I'll go next
Well,
week.
in fact, I missed it. He played UC Davis in 1972, but I wasn't there yet.
So the last question, just back to his music, it is still available. More is still being released, in fact. And this is where I want to mention, and this is thanks to the Mendelssohns, the Peanuts soundtracks, if that's the right word to use, for the specials. So the Christmas one, Thanksgiving, Great Pumpkin, and more. Could you just tell us a little bit about those?
Sure.
Because this is music that in some cases has never been released before, right?
Not commercially.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, the other drawback of doing a book like this is that I've been hounded by people for more than a decade when is somebody going to release a soundtrack to It's the Great Pumpkin? And my answer was always the same. Nobody knows if the studio tapes still exist. It wasn't lack of desire. Well, I mean, I should let Jason talk to you outside once we're done. One of the rare good things that came of COVID was that he and his brother Sean got together with folks down in Bill Melendez studios, and they searched, and they found some stuff. So as a result, yes, the first one was It's the Great Pumpkin, and that was followed by Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, and most recently by It Was a Short Summer, Charlie Brown, and You're Not Elected, Charlie Brown. And mind you, this isn't just music that previously you could only hear if you watched the special. These are the full long takes, when in some cases the song would have been truncated for the show, plus alternate takes and bonus tracks. And I think the Mendelssohns are planning on stuff for 2025, but I can't talk about that.
In case people haven't figured out yet, one of the Mendelssohns is in the room with us, so I think Derrick's you're baiting him a little bit, I think, there. So point is, there's still music of his that he recorded that we're still getting to hear 50 years later.
These albums are charting via Billboard now. Think about that. Music that is half a century old, being played by a guy who is half a century gone.
Yeah. So that's Vince Guaraldi at the piano, to do a play on your book title there.
Any questions?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes, just a few. Any questions anyone wants to ask?
Yes, go.
Did you ever hear him live? Did you ever get to see him live? And the trio remained the same so the Linus and Lucy song, the drummer for that song plays brushes and sticks in the same song. It's not easy.
No, it's not. That was Colin Bailey was the drummer at that point in time. His first, he had a couple of classic trios. The first one was during the days that he played at the Hungry Eye. That was a piano guitar bass trio with Dean Riley and Eddie Duran. That was the same configuration that Nat King Cole used early in his career. No drummer. And then his next great trio was with bassist Monty Budwig and drummer Colin Bailey. And that's the trio that did Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus and A Boy Named Charlie Brown and most of A Charlie Brown Christmas. The last one is the subject of controversy, which I'm not about to get into. But after that, he also worked with lots of other trios. Toward the end of his career, bassists and drummers it was kind of like musical doors, but they all adapted to his style.
So the drummer was Colin Bailey on Linus and Lucy?
And there's a part in your book where you talked to one of the drummers and said that Guaraldi liked the drummers to play with a stick and a brush. Not one or the other, but both while playing.
And Colin, Colin was one of my favorite interviews. I think I chatted with him 4 different times for like an hour and a half each time. And he lived in an apartment, don't remember what city, doesn't matter. And I'm thinking, okay, we got a drummer in an apartment. How does that work? he had built a soundproof cubicle in one end of the apartment, which is where his kit was. And and he demonstrated it to me. And he went in there, and I stayed outside, thank you very much. And he wailed like hell. And of course, I could hear him pretty well, but it was very effectively muffled. I was impressed. So he was.
We got time for one more question. He is going to be signing books afterwards, and he's approachable. You can
Get up yet. I got a surprise.
Yeah, but one more question.
You mentioned he never. All ear. All ear.
The first time he tried out for Woody Herman's band, he failed in 1955 because he couldn't adapt to the changes quickly enough because he couldn't read the music. So he woodshedded for the next year, very intentionally. That means practicing constantly. Constantly. So when he tried the second time in late 1956, Herman took him on. So that tells you how good he was not reading music. Yeah.
You know, this also makes me think, what's the idea? You do something for 10,000 hours and you get good. So he probably did 100,000 hours before he was 20. I mean,
Yeah,
the
well,
intensity that he played.
You know, Colin loved to tell the fact that when they cut the record, Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus, which had Cast Your Fate to the Wind, he said the sound check took longer than it took us to record the album because they'd been playing this stuff 3 sets a week, 3 sets a night, 6 nights a week for the past 6 months. Of course they were ready.